All right, so we're back at East Coast Gear Supply as always. Chase and I here with this beautiful KP 540 front axle. And we're going to talk about the things that terminology that we as axle builders just use all the time, that the common person who's buying their first axle, they might not know what that means. So I'm just going to ask you some questions. We're going to go through the entire axle. So when someone calls up and orders an axle and you ask them what WMS they want, what do you mean?
Wheel mount surface.
All right, and so that's from here to here.
Correct, right where your wheel would mount, because this is the dimension that we're going to set to make sure, you know, it fits your project. Plus, we know all the factory, you know, wheel mount surface dimensions. So if you say, well, I want it 4 inches, we have a starting point, especially on rears, because they don't want to take the wheels off or something. And they're like, well, from backing plate to backing plate, it's, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have that dimension, but I know what wheel mount is.
From factory.
Yes.
So if someone says 4 inches wider, you know. So wheel mount surface, that's surface to surface. All right. Pinion offset.
So pinion offset is the pinion offset from center line. And one common misconception we have there is when we ask people, they'll measure from center of pinion to wheel mount, and center of pinion to wheel mount, and it's 20 and 30, and it's a 10-inch offset. But it's not accurate.
Yes.
It's from center line is what we're talking about.
Okay.
So how far is it from the center line? So if you're 60 WMS,
Yep.
30 is your center line,
Yep.
and if you're 25, then you're 5-inch offset.
5-inch offset.
Not 10.
Okay. Caster angle versus pinion angle.
Okay.
So first let's talk about what is caster angle.
Caster is how far the C's are rolled back, and that will force your tire into the ground, basically. It'll put a little pressure on it. If you've ever driven a vehicle that feels really light in the front end and it's kind of like you're floating, it's because it doesn't have enough caster. It's not rotated back.
And when you lift a vehicle, if they don't have adjustable control arms,
Correct.
what tends to happen is you lose that caster because you're
Correct.
lifting the vehicle up and the axle's rotating forward.
Yeah.
Now, if someone's building a custom axle, caster versus pinion angle. What pinion angle do you suggest specifically on a front axle?
Well, it depends on what kind of drive shaft you have. Most, you know, late model is going to have a CV drive shaft, so you got 2 U-joints, you know, at the transfer case. So you want the pinion to point at the transfer case. Whereas if you have a 2-joint shaft, just a single joint at the T-case and a single at the axle, then in theory you would want them parallel. However, even in a 2-joint shaft, typically in a front, you do want to turn the pinion up some, because as it droops out, that angle starts to get, if you run straight parallel, when it droops out, that angle starts to get really difficult to not bind your drive shaft.
Yeah, so even if just at a standard would be about a 10-degree up on this.
Correct.
10 degrees up
Yeah.
with, what do you use, 7 to 9 caster back?
6 is your standard that we run. You always want 6.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's caster, that's pinion offset. Let's talk about...
Well, so when we're talking about caster and pinion, because it's important,
yes.
you know, again, on a stock axle, when you lift it and you lose caster, well, if you want to get caster back, your pinion angle is going to go down,
Yeah.
which again, you've increased this angle. So that's a lot of what we do is, you know, maximizing your angles and caster. So we're almost always adding a little pinion and caster to what an OE setup would be.
Because it's going to be in a bigger, especially with an axle like this.
Sure.
It's going to be in a lifted vehicle with probably larger wheels and tires. Okay, so axle tube size.
Yeah.
So obviously that just means size of axle tube.
So strength, OD of tube, is a little bit more important than the thickness of wall tube. So you can get a lot more strength out of increasing the OD versus just increasing the wall thickness. So obviously increasing wall thickness helps, but when you go to this bigger axle tube, you get a lot of strength, which is why you've seen, you know, the older 1-ton trucks had 3 1/8 tubes in them. Well, now go look under your 1-ton trucks. They have 4-inch tubes in them.
Yeah, so a thinner wall, but same as a drive
Correct.
shaft. You see drive shafts, the longer they get, the bigger round they get, more strength in it.
And from a weight perspective, if we're trying to increase strength and not weight, going to that larger OD, you know, will save some weight over you just you go into 1-inch wall.
Yeah,
Adds a lot of weight.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about the center section. Obviously, on the front, you have a bunch of different options. Let's talk about high pinion versus low pinion front.
Yeah, so high pinion in a front, you're going to run on the strong side of the gear. So that's the drive side. So whenever you're running a low pinion in a front application, because of the rotation of a front, you're actually running on the weaker side of a gear. It's about 20% weaker. So example would be a Chevy Dana 60. It's a low pinion Dana 60. So a very popular swap that we do is we'll build you a new high pinion housing, but we'll build it to your Chevy spec so you could take all your stuff and just swap it over.
And the high pinion gear set, often referred to as reverse rotation.
Correct.
It's not rotating backwards.
Correct.
It's just you're running on that stronger side of the gear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another common. And by putting a low pinion axle in the front, we're not turning it backwards. It's still going to drive forwards when we put it in gear.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you put a 14-bolt center here, we'd get a 14-bolt center, but it would just have a low pinion.
Correct. It would be low pinion. It would still drive straight, but we have had people who are like, well, I'm just going to flip it over. Okay, well, it's going to drive backwards.
Yes,
when you
the
do
car's
that.
going to get shorter and longer every time you drive it. Okay, so high pinion versus low pinion. Let's talk about selectable locker versus mechanical locker. So if I'm building an axle, first let's talk about the difference. What's the difference between a selectable versus or mechanical or automatic locker?
One's selectable.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, easy. You choose when it's locked and when it's not.
Yeah, so, you got ARB, Eaton, Auburn, are a couple of your options, Ox Locker. So on demand, you can basically turn it into a spool, right? Lock both tires together so they're both pulling at the same time. And the nice part about that is there's no downside to it when you're not using it. It's going to be completely open, and when you want it, you turn it on, and away you go. Obviously, there's more expense with a selectable locker, and ARB, you got to run airline, E-locker, you got to run the wiring harness, wire it, all that stuff. So, expense and downside. So again, if it's a buggy, a spool is a spool.
Spool will always be locked.
So
Yes.
mechanical lockers, which honestly have become less and less popular for us. However, I don't mind them in a front. What most mechanical lockers do, and there's a couple different versions, but we'll take like a Detroit Grizzly locker, for instance, is when you apply torque to it and it spins up, it locks up. Now, if you let power off of it and you go into a corner, it will jump teeth in the locker. So that does give you better steering, especially in tight trails and stuff when you're off the gas. But as soon as you're back into it, it locks back up. So it's a cheaper solution. You still get really good traction, but you get better steering. Now, with an ARB or selectable or whatever, you turn it off and your steering is great.
Yeah.
But, I've been in situations, and I actually run a mechanical locker in a lot of my front stuff. If you're in tight areas going uphill and you can't steer and you're going around trees, it is nice to not be trying to push buttons and do all the things.
Yeah.
So.
It's also going to lock. You don't have to remember to turn it on.
Correct. Yeah.
But if it is anything, in my opinion, if it's going to be any type of street use, definitely it's worth doing the selectable locker in the front. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about ox tube, selectable locker, wheel mount surface. Oh, so I decided that we would play this game as well because we're going to have this fun right here. So I decided that because I'm sure that everyone here probably answers the phones with this stuff because we all know the internet is always right.
Correct.
When we do this thing. So hold on. What is the best width axle for a Jeep JK?
It's going to say 72.
And the internet says 65.375.
That's pretty narrow.
So the internet is wrong, right? So what would you say is the best width axle for a Jeep JK that's going to run an oversized wheel and tire?
So good question. Not an answer.
Okay.
It all depends on what wheel. So common misconception and what everybody's doing is they're like, oh, I want a 72 WMS. I want a 73.5 because they read it on the internet or on somebody's build. Well, okay, why do you want that? What wheels are you buying? Well, I don't know. Or, oh, I already have the wheels. Okay, are you sure this is what you want? So 72 and 73.5 is very wide. In fact, especially if you have like a 3.5-inch backspace wheel, which is like super common, I would not run a 72 with a 3.5. If you're running a 72 WMS, you're going to want to be in that 4.5 to 5.5 backspace range.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what that does is it'll move the tire inboard. But if you run 73.5 with 3.5, don't expect to park in your single wide garage.
Exactly.
With 42s.
And that, yeah, and that brings up the next question, scrub radius. So scrub radius, changing that backspace of the wheel is going to affect the scrub radius.
Correct. So scrub radius has to do with kingpin inclination, which is at what angle is the kingpin steering axis turning, and then how far away your center line of tire to wheel mount surface is. So the farther this rotor or wheel mount surface sits from kingpin center line is the scrub radius combined with this kingpin axis. So if you make a larger kingpin axis, it turns better. And if you shrink this, it turns better. So the other way you can deal with it is with a wheel offset. So if the tire comes in more over this center line, then it's going to turn better. You're going to have a tighter scrub radius.
Yeah, because you're essentially where that angle meets the ground versus the center line of the tire. If they can hit at the exact same spot, it's like you're turning on the pinpoint of that tire. So if someone's ordering the width of their axle, the first, like you said, the first question they need to figure out is what wheels are we running? Wheels. And then can they get that 4.5 or on a 9-inch wide wheel with a 4.5-inch backspace, it's basically 0.
Correct.
So it's right in the center, and then they'll be able to run that little bit wider axle and get the tire and wheel tucked in a little bit.
That's one of the big upgrades of this Kingpin 540 here is the scrub radius and the kingpin inclination. We've increased that angle, and this is a pretty tight scrub radius compared to our older kingpin stuff or other ball joint 60s on the market. They have a wider scrub radius. When we designed this, that was a big portion of it is, hey, let's tighten it up. Let's get the scrub radius, but we maintain the longer stub shaft in it. This axle has the best scrub radius on the market, but we left that spindle long. So people, you know, some people are like, oh, I don't want my wheel hub to stick out that far, right? Yeah. Well, the reason why ours, and it's not crazy in my opinion, but the reason why we did that is so that we can grow that spindle length, which means we can grow that stub shaft. And with a longer stub shaft, there's a lot more torsional load that can be absorbed.
Yeah.
So
okay, now steering. Full hydro versus hydro assist. So if someone's, the beauty of this axle is they're not committed to this forever. Correct. So if this is going in, let's say it's going in someone's JK, we can hook up basically standard drag link and hydro assist.
Yes.
And then in the future, if they want to upgrade to full hydro, maybe the Jeep's coming off the road, it's just going to be off-road only, you can change this over to a full hydro setup, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so the whole reason why we designed these without cast-in arms is just for, you know, adaptability. I mean, we could make a push-pull steering arm to go over there, you know, but this current setup is just, you know, drag links coming up top. It is going to be underneath the steering arm because that angle to get it, you know, on the same plane as the track bar is very good to go under here. But if you had like a really lifted Jeep, we have an arm that you can now mount on the top side of this. So again, you can start to perfect your angles. And then if you did want to go full hydro, we've got arms that bolt on up top, and then you'll run a dual shear bolt through the center, and then you can mount your ram, you know, anywhere. So one tricky part, if you've ever tried to, you know, mount a ram single shear and not have your, and keep your, you know, links parallel, the nice part about the dual shear tie-in is you don't necessarily have to be perfect because you can mount your tie rod links anywhere in between.
Yeah, because you're just going to put a spacer above and below and fine-tune that in there. CVs versus U-joints. So this KP540 design carrying 1550 U-joint or Big Bell RCV, is there, when do you make that decision for as a customer? When am I going to decide I want the Big Bell I want RCVs or do I want U-joints?
Well, some of it's your checkbook.
Yep. Okay, that's a very good reason. Yeah.
So the Big Bell RCVs are extremely strong, 300M internals, 100% American-made, heat-treated, you know, almost one-off capabilities. Also, the smoothness in steering. So in a U-joint shaft, when you go full lock, it's going to want to hop and bind those U-joints up because they're not designed to spin fast at, full lock. Well, buggy, full lock, hammer down.
Yeah.
And so you'll start to get that
That's
hop.
where you see the front end doing this.
Yeah, yeah. So CVs, do eliminate that. They don't like going over a certain angle either as far as like strength, because you do start to put stress on them. But like this is big, bad as much as.
So realistically, what it boils down to when you're going to go U-joint versus CV, it's honestly just the money.
Yeah, well, the 1550 U-joints, the billet Brannick joints, I mean, you're not going to break them.
Yeah, they're strong. Yeah.
And in our 40 spline stuff, some people, they want RCVs because they want the best of the best, and they've broken a lot of stuff. But when you get into this 40 spline and the 1550 billet joints, this is the stuff that can you break it? Yes, but you're going to have to really abuse and beat and bounce and all those things. So either are great options. The one last thing is the 40 spline locking hub that we have, which lockouts are great if you're driving on the street, certainly. But really why I designed the lockout hub, especially for an axle like this, because this is very extreme and everybody's like, oh, just put slugs in it. The locking hub is the fuse on this axle. And so you have an outermost portion on the axle that will fail before you start exploding major components that ruin your trip. So, my suggestion to anybody, buggy driver or whatever, hey man, just put the locking hubs in it and carry a set of slugs. Yeah. So if you do go for a 2-week adventure and you break something, it should be that locking hub, and you can swap slugs in, continue on your day. You can call us. A very simple repair. You don't even have to take the wheel off. Yeah.
The other nice thing is with the locking hub is if you have a mechanical locker or a spool, you can unlock it and do a little bit of street driving if you have to, or just maneuverability around a little bit easier than with the slug. If you have a slug and the spool or mechanical locker, it's always, you're going to know it's there.
Yeah, get the strength of this, and especially when you get into like an 80 front or a 14 bolt front, the strength of this axle, it's going to be a pretty epic explosion. Yeah. If something lets go. And that's why I like to have, something that like, let's let go and start over.
There we go. All right, so I think we've covered everything. So that should answer all the questions that you would have about picking the axle and the information that you need to know before you call East Coast Clear Supply and write a big check.